They never tell you that the ocean keeps score, that it remembers the weight of a child's scooter abandoned by the riverwalk, the hush of neighbors holding their breath as sirens pinch the evening into a single blue line of fear, or the silence that follows when a jury says a man still isn't safe to come home. Not now, maybe not for years. I learned that in Santa Cruz, 2015, where the gulls tried to talk over the truth and failed, and where an aging reporter with a bad knee and worse coffee found out that cases don't close just because you add the word solved to a headline. Some endings open doors the living would rather keep nailed shut. I was standing outside the Tannery Arts Center just after midnight, July 27th, when the night touring half-detective's tape the groan of a recycling bin pivoting like a tired jaw. A boy's face hovered at the edge of the crowd. Too calm, notebooks later would call him meticulous, but the streetlight gave him a theater mask. Tragedy on one side, nothing on the other. When they found her, the world narrowed to shoe scuffs, whispered prayers, and the sound of a pen scratching time into a notebook, because some of us only know how to mourn by recording it. 9 years later, a jury would say he still couldn't come home, that danger has a residue even after candles burn down and murals fade, and that the law changed in ways that made neighbors argue across fences they once shared. But in 2015, all I knew was the ocean kept score, and that the numbers didn't add up. I'm not a believer in ghosts, though I keep a spare seatbelt buckled in my car for the ones that insist on riding along old habit, superstition, gallows humor, take your pick. I am, however, a believer in patterns, and in Santa Cruz the pattern was this. A child vanished, a boy confessed, a city blinked, and time refused to move forward in a straight line. The first pattern break landed the day after, when I played back my field recorder and heard, under the radio chatter and the clatter of the bin, a sound like a yo-yo string slapping a calloused palm swip snap out of rhythm with everything else that night. It could have been a zipper, a strap, a loose lanyard, but I knew the boy's hobby from the neighbors, long before the press conference confirmed his name, age, and charges that would soon tangle with the law the state hadn't invented yet. The sound didn't creep me out, not exactly. It felt like an underline, a teacher's red pen across a line no one wanted to reread. Second pattern break. A muralist painting by dawn on a wall near the river, eyes wide as tide pools, pupils inside pupils, the kind of gaze that follows you down a block and makes you check if your zipper's up and your soul is in order. He said he'd dreamed her face before anyone published the school photo, and I laughed because sometimes you have to or the air won't go in, but I still wrote his name in the margin and circled it twice. Third break. My coffee cup sweating a ring on the courthouse step in 2018, while a senator's signature rewired the past tense into the present, closing one door and opening another with the gentlest click of a pen. By 2021, the building that held the boy wasn't the building that would hold him later. When a place closes, it doesn't mean it lets go. It just changes its handprint on your shoulder. When he turned 25, a jury had to decide whether time had polished him or only made him smooth to the touch, while the blade stayed sharp within, and neighbors returned to the courthouse the way some folks return to church only on holidays and funerals. Truth is, none of that explains why, in my kitchen at 3 a.m., the yo-yo sound played under the kettle, or why my voicemail filled with messages of static that, when reversed, sounded like the ocean counting. This isn't a haunting story, not in the flickering lights, pots banging way. It's about the arithmetic of grief and the ledger the coast keeps for us when we put down our pens. If you've ever waited on a test result or a callback that decides who you get to be next, you already know what Santa Cruz felt like that week. The stretch of minutes that make a life into a thin wire, humming. What follows is the part even the transcripts won't give you. The way the wind off the Pacific learned a child's name and wouldn't stop saying it, syllables dissolving into mist on the river, where scooters spark like minnows when sunlight finally shows up to clock in. My name's Nate Harlan, 48 back then, a reporter who mostly covered city budgets and weird weather until weirdness stopped asking for permission. I keep a notebook of things that repeat: sirens, headlines, the word still. As in he's still a danger, we're still a community, she's still gone, and the ocean's still keeping score like a meticulous bookkeeper with all the time in the world. If you're listening in your car or at the sink after dinner, you'll want to know whether this story ends with an answer. It does, but not the one you think, because sometimes solved only means we've identified the hand, not the shadow that moved it. Take this as a promise. By the time we're done, you'll hear what I heard and decide for yourself whether justice turns or whether we just keep shoving the same heavy door, hoping the hinges don't squeal as loud as last time. And yes, there will be a joke somewhere, probably about my ex-wife's hatred of my coffee or my knee predicting rain better than the weather app. Even in a dark room, someone has to crack a glow stick. But first, the scooter, the courtyard, the boy at the edge of the tape, and the yo-yo string that won't stop counting down. I kept thinking about the river, how it courses like a sentence that never finds a period, only commas that make you catch your breath at odd places. In July, the air tastes like metal near the Tannery, like a coin you're afraid to spend, because once it leaves your palm, it's gone forever. That night, men and women with badges tried to buy the truth with time and patience. And the river was exact change, offered and refused. Call it a superstition. But when a city whispers, you answer. When a law shifts the floor under your feet, you widen your stance, pretend it was your idea, and keep talking. So here's where I begin again. With a hallway light left on in a second-floor unit, a freezer door that doesn't seal right, and a boy who asked me once if I'd ever tried to stall time, because you can if you throw enough loops into the air and watch them fall in slow motion. He smiled like a streetlight, half lit, half not, and I wrote down his smile because some details weigh more than others when the ocean counts. I told you I wasn't a ghost guy, but there are other kinds of visitors patterns that insist, numbers that recur, sounds that map a city the way old fishermen map currents no app admits exist. In that map, the courthouse sits on a knuckle bone, the tannery on a tendon, and the river is a long, blue question that never needed a mark to be understood. When the law changed, you could feel the city sprain. When the jury spoke years later, you could feel it rest the ankle, test the weight, and wince. I carry a little recorder, because memory is a rumor at my age. And in the rumor mill of Santa Cruz, 2015 was a storm that never moved off the coast. On the tape, you can hear a detective say, "Careful," and another answer, "I know." And over both voices, the swift snap of the yo-yo string, keeping pace like a metronome for a song no one asked to learn. Later, when headlines turned to laws and facilities and birthdays that sounded like deadlines, that same rhythm returned, as if the city itself had learned the trick loop, release, and the ocean catches what you drop every time. If this is too poetic for you, blame the coast. It frays the edge of things until prose unravels, and you're left knitting with metaphors in the dark. But stay with me, because the next part is simpler. A neighbor's porch light, a question at a press line, and a hand on a trash bin that felt too warm for midnight. When they lifted the lid, the night became an inventory. Sneakers, gloves, a hush that felt like a verdict long before any judge spoke. And that's when the ocean ticked another number on its page, neat and small, like a clerk with good penmanship. I told the muralist I didn't believe in premonitions, but I gave him my number anyway, because sometimes the people who dream are better at daylight than the rest of us. He sent me a photo at 5:12 a.m. eyes, pupils inside pupils, and a smear of blue that looked like the river learned to stand up and walk captioned, "It won't stop looking at me." Neither would the story. The neighbor with the porch light was named Carina, and she had that permanent half-squint of coastal folks who learned to read fog like a mood ring. "You're late," she told me as if truth were a bus, and I'd missed it by minutes. And I wrote her name down because even skeptics collect witnesses like charms on a bracelet for days when logic snaps. She pointed to the courtyard where the scooter would have glittered if there'd been sun, and her pointer finger quivered like she'd kept it aimed there since sunset and didn't trust it to point anywhere else. "Did you hear anything strange?" I asked, and braced for the usual shouts, engines, the sound of a city grinding its teeth, but Carina shrugged. "Just the ocean," she said, and tilted her head like the waves had called her by her middle name, the one only parents use when you've gone too far and can't get back clean. That was the trick in Santa Cruz. The ocean was always there, so it made a lousy alibi and a perfect culprit. The muralist, Diego, had coffee with me at a plywood table outside a bakery that pretended scones could fix a community's circulation. He tapped his cup lid to a rhythm that, if you didn't know better, sounded like casual nerves. I knew better, because it matched my recorder's ghost. Track swip-snap, the metronome of something that wanted to be counted, but refused to be named. "I've painted eyes since I was 10, he said, "but these, they look at you like they already know what you're going to do when you think you have a choice." I told him that wasn't how eyes worked, and he laughed, then grew still, then said a thing no one likes to hear. "I dreamed the courtyard exactly, but not the people in it." Dreams love props and hate accountability, and yet he described the cracked tile near the drainage, the uneven step, the tree that looked healthy, but wasn't details your boots pick up, not your subconscious. I checked my notes from the scene and felt the inside of my chest tighten around a thought I didn't want to keep. What if grief makes maps, and some of us are born with the wrong kind of compass? I wish the story turned easy there, with some neat confession that flattened the mystery to paperwork. But the paperwork in this case started breeding footnotes and new nouns transfers. Hearings, facilities like the law had discovered, could multiply in self-defense. People asked me, off record and on back porches, what I thought about kids who do grown-up harm, and I learned to say the truest, most unsatisfying sentence in English. It's complicated. Complicated is the last place people want to live. Sadly, it's where most of us pitch our tents. At night, I replayed my tape to drown out the quiet in my apartment, and the metronome kept slipping between the voices loop, release, loop, release, like someone coiling time and letting it drop to see if it bounced. I tried to match it with ordinary things. A zipper? No. A lanyard? Maybe. A yo-yo? Yes, but where? Until the sound nested in my head and woke me every hour on the hour, precise as an anxious church bell. When sleep did come, the ocean stood at the foot of my bed like a dog too polite to climb up, just watching, waiting for a command I didn't know how to give. If you're still with me, you're probably like me, someone who's had to live past a neat resolution and make breakfast anyway. Maybe you've sat through a verdict that felt like an answer and still found yourself checking the deadbolt twice for the next 3 years, because answers don't tuck you in. People do, and sometimes they're gone. That's when the city starts keeping you, the way the ocean keeps score. The first time the boy spoke to me, it wasn't really to me. It was to a semicircle of microphones that believed attention could purify anything if you gave it enough voltage. His voice was thin and deliberate, a straight edge drawing through a messy page, and what struck me wasn't what he said. Counsel had sanded the edges. It was how he watched the corners of the room, like he expected time to emerge from the drywall, late and apologetic. That look lives in the faces of chess players and people who've made a decision they can't return, like a wrong-size shirt. "Do you ever yo-yo?" I asked him later, a question so strange it earned me a head tilt from a detective and a frown from my editor when I filed. He blinked, and smiled the half-smile that looks rehearsed until you notice the tremor in the eyelid that gives it away. "Time doesn't like to be pulled," he said, and I wrote it down even though I didn't understand it, because later I'd wish I had more small pebbles like that to weigh down the big ones. I promise jokes, so here's a small one. My ex-wife always said I collected phrases like bottle caps, which is accurate, except she never appreciated how often bottle caps keep you from cutting your foot on someone else's broken glass. I keep phrases because factual truth moves like a school of fish reel, but never where you expect when you look in language is the net we throw and mend and throw again. What net do you throw at a sound that shouldn't exist on a tape recorded in open air? Diego's eyes found me at the bakery a week later with a new painting. Not a face this time, but a hand hovering over water, fingers splayed, skin pruned like it had already been submerged and had come back with secrets. I can't stop hearing it, he said, and we didn't need to name the it. Whatever language you speak, grief teaches you a pronoun first. The hand's shadow looked too sharp for morning shadows, softened with mercy in early light, but this one cut like noon, and I wrote that down too. People assume reporters like answers. What we really like are patterns we can draw around with a highlighter until they look like answers from across the room. The pattern here kept folding back on itself: ocean, recorder, art, law, ocean again, like someone was practicing an origami crane and couldn't get past step 7. Meanwhile, hearings brewed, new facilities replaced old ones. Experts argued risk on scales with names that sounded like satellites. And every announcement made the city flinch or exhale, rarely both. When the law shifted, friends who teach civics texted me links and said, "This changes everything." And friends who work in trauma said, "It doesn't change what happened." And both were right the way two shores on a river are right without touching. The boys' birthdays turned to court dates and then to risk assessments. And each time the city lined up its hope and its dread and asked the same old new question: who gets to come home and when? If you think there's a clean answer to that, you're either new here or lucky, and both conditions expire. Now the part I've avoided, the unexplainable that refuses to stay in metaphor. Around 3 in the morning, the stove clock in my apartment blinked 3:03, paused, then slid backward to 3:02, then forward again, like a timid dancer who forgot the next step and faked confidence. The recorder off clicked anyway, and the tape inside twitched like a heartbeat you can't see but can feel if you lay your palm on your own chest and wait. I called Karina at a rude hour because some people answer when the ocean speaks, and she did, and said only, "Listen," so I did. It was the river, not the ocean, a smaller insistence, and beneath it a sound like a loop, thrown and caught, the way a yo-yo returns to the same patient palm, whoever's hand it is. "It started after midnight," she said, "and the gulls won't land on the railings. They keep circling like the alphabet lost 3 letters and can't spell landing anymore. People always ask why I didn't tell someone official. I did, and they nodded and wrote it down and then kept doing the work that mattered on paper and in rooms with seals above the doors, which is the correct response to a man bringing you a ghost that behaves like a sound engineer. But I also told Diego, and he painted the river not as water, but as ribbon, wound around a hand that wasn't there, and yet cast a shadow heavy as iron. We looked at the painting and didn't talk for a while, because some observations are just receipts you put in your wallet in case you need to prove to yourself later that you bought what happened. When the next hearing came years later, the city stood outside the courthouse like it was standing outside its own house after losing the keys, half angry at itself, half convinced the lock had changed while it slept. Language tried to carry the weight: rehabilitation, risk, secure, release, and kept dropping it for the same reason we drop anything: fingers tire. The jury did its work, and the word still perched on everyone's lips again, fluttering like it wanted to be past tense and knew it couldn't be yet. If you're waiting for me to say what the sound means, you've confused me with someone braver or more foolish. Meanings are verdicts, and this isn't that yet. What I can give you is a promise and a map. Follow the loop to the courtyard to the river to the ocean, and the ocean back to the tape that shouldn't remember anything, and yet remembers enough to keep me awake. Somewhere in that loop is the hinge where justice turns, or refuses to, and if I can put my hand on it, maybe the door will move, and we'll stop bruising our shoulders against wood that prefers to be a wall. Next, I'll take you to the exact spot where the recorder picked up the cleanest version of the sound, and to the man who swore he heard it first, long before 2015, and called it the Tannery metronome, as if naming a thing could make it local, and therefore less terrifying. He runs a bait shop that smells like memory and salt, and he keeps a ledger older than most of our excuses. And if anyone knows how the ocean keeps score, it's a man who sells what the sea reluctantly returns. The bait shop sits under a faded sign that once promised live bait, honest weights, which is cute if you've never tried to weigh absence on a certified scale. The owner, Mac, looks like the ocean carved him out of driftwood and then changed its mind and put him back on shore with a ledger and a bell that rings when customers enter, or when the wind decides commerce needs encouragement. "You're Nate," he said, which is either a guess or a small-town superpower, and he flipped the ledger open to a page marked with a rusted paperclip the color of old blood. "What are we looking at?" I asked, and Mac tapped the column titled Returns, a word that means one thing to fishermen and another to people who keep replaying tapes at 3 a.m. The entries were dates and notes in a tidy hand nets fouled, crab pots light, gulls circling without landing, small things that add up to a pattern when your job is noticing the sea's bad moods. "You see that?" he said, tapping July 2015, where the notes grew cramped, like someone writing while the bench shook. "Gulls wouldn't land for 3 nights, he read. River ran like it had somewhere better to be, and the Tannery metronome loud as church bells. He looked at me as if I'd argue with the phrase he'd capitalized in his voice, and I didn't, because sometimes naming is how you introduce yourself to fear without letting it move in. "You heard it before 2015? I asked, and he nodded, slow, like agreement cost him something. "Once in 09, once in 12, he said. "Always late. Always when the river's mean. Mean rivers don't foam and snarl. They get polite and efficient, like a clerk who closes exactly at 5, no matter who's still in line. And that's how the San Lorenzo sounded the week a scooter became a signal flare none of us understood in time." Mac closed the ledger with a thud like a period, and the bell over the door chimed even though no one opened it, which is probably just physics and also exactly how belief slips in through drafts. On the way out, I passed a poster for a lost dog whose eyes looked like Diego painted them pupil. Inside pupil, a copy that knew it was a copy and didn't mind. If you're waiting for a car chase or a revelation in a basement, wrong genre. This is coastal, where the drama is in the wind's pressure and the tide's schedule and the way as community relearns how to say each other's names after a verdict. Still, I checked my recorder before I hit the sidewalk and found, inexplicably, that it had recorded 8 seconds of silence while it was off, and the silence was not silent at all. It was loop, release, like a heartbeat interrupting itself. I took the tape to a friend at the station, who tolerates me because I once covered her. Inauguration as Queen of the Chili Cook-Off, with a gravity usually reserved for spacecraft launches. She fed it through software that paints sound as color, and the screen grew bands, like a sequoia's rings thick, where the city shouted, thin where the city held its breath, and there, a braid of repeats too regular to be random. "If this is a hoax," she said, "it's a very patient one, which is not comforting if you like your hauntings brief and your answers single use." The courthouse felt colder the day. The phrase turning point stopped being metaphor and became minutes on a calendar, the sort you circle and then avoid looking at until it arrives anyway, punctual as sorrow. People wore memory like a uniform: buttons, ribbons, shirts, the way you armor yourself when the room will ask you to sit still while strangers weigh a future you'll have to live in. In the hallway, a woman passed me a peppermint like we were at church, and the sermon had gone long. And I took it, because kindness is the only currency that spends in every economy. There's a point in every hearing where language becomes a mirror that shows you the back of your own head risk, rehabilitation, release, and you realize you've been rehearsing this conversation with yourself for years. A clinician spoke about scales and scores, and the numbers tried to do what numbers do: simplify, clarify, absolve. But the ocean doesn't care about scales, and neither does grief. Both prefer currents to categories. If you want me to say what justice is, you're listening to the wrong man. I only know how it feels when it brushes past you in a hallway and doesn't stay to talk. What I can tell you is that on the day the jury said still, the wind outside did something I'll never find a decent word for. It quieted in a way that made noise louder, like the city inhaled and chose not to exhale until it got home and locked the door. The peppermint dissolved slow against my tongue, and the recorder in my pocket warmed like a small animal that trusted me for reasons I couldn't defend. Diego met me by the river with a new canvas he didn't want to show and couldn't stop holding, the way you carry a sleeping child from a car. He'd painted a door where the river meets the ocean, hinges of kelp, handle of driftwood, and beyond it a room that looked exactly like the Tannery elevator, except it was made of water and lit from within like courage. I dreamed the door, he said, and the sound was a key. Keys open and lock, I said, because sometimes a cliché is the right tool, like a flathead screwdriver you use on a Phillips screw, because it's what you have, and it mostly works if you're careful. Which is this? He asked, and I didn't answer, because the recorder clicked on by itself and captured the river making its arithmetic again. Loop, loop, release, and for once I heard something beneath it, like a child practicing a scale on a piano in a house where adults don't sleep through music. I went home by the long route, past the courtyard, past the bin I can't not see even when it's not there, past the apartment light that stays on for nobody now. The gulls traced lazy figure eights that felt like rote prayers. Not the pleading kind, but the kind you say because your grandmother did and because it has kept heartbeats going this far. That night, at 3:03, the clock stayed put and the recorder stayed off, and the silence sounded like mercy, which is a dangerous thing to mistake for safety. In the morning, Carina waved me over to her porch like she was flagging down a bus, only I could see. I think it's moving, she said, and I followed her finger to the far rail by the stairwell, where a shadow had no source, a shame-faced smudge that retreated when clouds passed and returned when sunlight grew too honest. It wasn't there yesterday, she added, as if we had both started using the courtyard like a calendar. Shadows are opinionated. They tell you what shape they prefer a thing to be and dare you to argue. This one looked like a hinge, a simple piece of hardware that only matters when it stops working, and I snapped a photo while pretending I was photographing the steps, which fooled neither of us. You're going to write a poem about that, aren't you? Carina said, and I promised I'd try very hard not to, which is different from saying I won't. The ex-wife texted to ask if I was eating enough greens, which is her way of saying she hopes I'm still myself, and I told her yes, even though the only green I'd eaten was a handful of envy at people who sleep like they mean it. She once told me I pocket sorrow like sea glass, smoothing it until it looks harmless. And she's not wrong, except sometimes the edges return when the weather changes. The forecast, for what it's worth, said marine layer until noon and then sun. But forecasts don't include verdicts or anniversaries, or whether a city is ready to say still again. At afternoon, Mac called. Metronome's back, he said. No hello, just work. And I jogged knee complaining to the river, where he stood with the ledger open like a priest with a liturgy. The sound rolled thin as floss and thick as rope, and Diego arrived panting with a fresh can of blue he didn't open, like a talisman. Door, he said, and I heard it then. Not the door opening, not closing, but testing, like a shoulder against wood. If you've ever helped move a couch through a doorway, that seems exactly half an inch too narrow. You know the grunt a body makes when it refuses geometry. The river made that sound, small and unmistakable, and the gulls landed, just one, then three, like punctuation returning to a long, run-on sentence. We stood there not talking while the metronome slowed and then stilled, and the ocean pretended it had never kept score a day in its salty life. I'm not going to tell you this means healing or that a city can exhale because a sound stopped. That's not how it works, and you know it. But I will tell you this. That night, for the first time, the recorder captured a voice I recognize as my own saying, without my memory of saying it. You can come home when the door says so. And then laughing, soft and scared, like someone who just heard themselves promise a thing they don't control. The hinge-shadow didn't leave. It darkened in the noon sun like honesty, then paled at dusk the way guilt does when the porch lights come on and everybody pretends the day was normal enough to justify dishes and TV. Karina set out a second chair for me that I never used, a habit that made sense only to both of us. Presence can be heavy even when it's invisible, and the empty chair made the railings less alone. When the gulls returned in a proper chorus, the courtyard sounded briefly like a ballpark after a rain delay, cheerful in a way that felt borrowed. I spent the morning tracing the tannery's edges, the way you run your finger along a plate's crack to see whether it's surface or structural. The old hide house had become a theater, its acoustics tuned for grief and laughter, but not for whatever kept making my recorder flinch awake. A stagehand let me stand alone in the house-empty seats, watching like patient neighbors, and for a second, I thought I heard the metronome in the rafters, until it settled into something more human. A breath held, then released. You're chasing a shadow, my editor said over the phone, which is a fair thing to say to a man who started photographing hardware as if it were testimony. I'm cataloging weather, I said, which is how reporters dress superstition in a tie so it can come to the meeting. Bring me something I can print, she said, and I promised her a hinge that either opens or refuses to, because decisions are how you keep a job, and also the last thing this city can survive on a schedule. Mac called again at noon, ledger in hand like a hymn book, and pointed to a note from November 2015. Nothing supernatural, just the way the theater opened, and the gulls learned the new airflow above the roofline like they'd been briefed. Places change their sound when you change their purpose, he said, and tapped the page like a drum. The words hung there, practical and generous, and the river agreed by not disagreeing. You asked for personal details. Here's one. My left knee has been predicting rain since I took a foul line drive in a charity softball game in '03. Which is to say my body has its own forecast and rarely checks with me first. That knee started complaining at 2 p.m., though the sky was theatrically blue, and by 3 I could smell the kind of metallic promise that lives in summer storms like a dare. I stopped at Diego's studio, where a fan pushed warm air around like gossip, and found him working on a series of doors that didn't apologize for existing. Why hinges? He asked before I spoke, which is cheating, but forgivable when the paintings are that blunt. Because they're the part we forget until they squeal, I said, and because I have a shadow to argue with. He wiped his hands and said, paint the argument, then handed me a brush like it was a microphone at a public meeting where the agenda had already won. I laid down a line where my eye said the hinge should be, and the brush skipped like it hit grit the canvas clean. My hand steady, and yet a stutter in the paint, as if something beneath insisted on being acknowledged. Look, there are moments that make believers, but mostly belief is a slow draft that finds the cracks in your house and keeps coming in until you rearrange the furniture around it. Diego didn't say anything. He didn't have to. The stutter told both of us. This was a door we were already on the wrong side of. Around 4, a city staffer texted me a memo about the theater's future, now that the old tenant had bowed out, a practical puzzle of leases, costs, and community hopes that felt heavier than its paper weight. The colligan was between names on the letterhead and still full of names on the seats, which is to say, the room remembered everyone who told the truth in it, on purpose or by accident. Spaces have memories, the staffer wrote, maybe by mistake, maybe on purpose, and I circled it with a digital highlighter like that could anchor anything. At dusk, the hinge-shadow stretched like it wanted to become a sundial, and then thought better of it. Carina brought out 2 mugs, hers, a practical ceramic, mine a chipped one that said World's Okayest Reporter, one in a raffle where I put my own name on too many tickets, because sometimes you need a win you didn't steal. If it opens, she said, eyes on the shadow, what happens? And I said the bravest thing I could, we don't know, but we'll be here. Weather arrived like a rumor that turns out to be accurate, a wind that didn't match the forecast, a pressure change that makes birds rethink their errands, and the smell of rain learning our names. The first drop hit the rail by the hinge-shadow and spread in a circle that refused geometry, an oval like a mouth mid-vowel. The second drop traced a line straight down the post and then sideways, defying both gravity and good manners. And the third landed on my knuckles with the tenderness of a question. The recorder in my pocket warmed again, clicked, and took a deep breath on my behalf. I pulled it out and let it rest on the rail, its little red light the only traffic signal we had. The metronome didn't start. Instead, the air around us shifted in that subtle way concert halls do just before the conductor raises the baton expectation, tightening the room into a single attentive muscle. Mac's bell rang in the distance, maybe wind, maybe habit, and Diego texted a photo of a blue door with a single word. Now. The shadow at the rail fattened the way a bruise blooms when you remember how it happened, and then, without drama, it moved. Hinges don't travel. They host movement. This one slid like a chess piece, obeying a rule I hadn't learned, and the rail made a sound I felt in my molars. If you've ever opened a door you weren't supposed to utility closets, back of house, the room where the truth sleeps poorly, you know the quiet that follows is not empty. It's crowded with what-ifs. The courtyard stepped 1 degree colder, the way hospitals do when a refrigerator door is left open too long, and the recorder painted the chill as a thin blue band only software can see. Then came the smallest noise, not loop-loop release, but the shy click of something aligning 2 parts that had been waiting to recognize each other. I'm going to say a thing that sounds like a script, I told Carina, and she nodded, because consent matters even when you don't know what you're consenting to. If this is a door, and if it opens, we don't invite. We witness. We keep our hands to ourselves, I said, and she added, and we count, because counting is what the ocean taught us, and it felt impolite not to honor the lesson. The rain arrived for real, big drops generous enough to share, and the gulls retreated to the theater's eaves like critics who love a show but won't admit it in print. The hinge-shadow widened and then thinned, breathing, and the rail hummed a note that made my knees stop complaining, which is the only miracle I will claim under oath. The recorder captured our 2 breaths in sync, and between them, as soft as a child not wanting to wake a house, a voice. Not words exactly, but intent, the sound of permission. I wish I could tell you what opened, or for whom, or why the river downshifted to a calmer gear like a truck easing into a neighborhood at night. I can tell you that the metronome did not return, not then, and that the shadow, having traveled a precise hand's length, stopped and held that line like a guardrail. And I can tell you that Carina Practical, fog-reading Carina, let out a breath that sounded like someone putting down a bag after a long walk. Now what? She asked, because adults are in charge of endings in the same way we're in charge of weather. Now we wait, I said, the laziest of verbs and the bravest, and the theater across the way kept its lights off, but not its attention. The city hummed the low song cities hum when rain smooths sirens into lullabies, and everyone agrees, without saying it out loud, to behave. That night, in my apartment, the clock held steady at 3:03, and then, as if choosing, moved on. The recorder stayed blessedly quiet, like a child who has finally fallen asleep on the drive home. And I thought, not for the first time, that maybe Sald is a neighborhood you visit on good days rather than a house you own. Morning would bring lawyers and ledgers, and leases, and the work of living. The ocean, patient as ever, would keep score. Morning insists on ordinary things. Trash trucks, joggers, the coffee line that reenacts patience like a community theater classic, and the newspaper box that still takes coins as if time were a polite suggestion. I stood outside the bakery with a cup that could pass for courage and watched the theater across the way breathing, not with lights, but with intention, the kind you feel in your collarbone when a room is deciding something about you without your input. The hinge-shadow on Carina's rail held steady like a polite guest who understands boundaries better than most people do. Mac beat me to the river, ledger tucked under his arm like a salter, and nodded to the gulls who were back to their old irreverence, arguing over drops of nothing as if they were pearls. No metronome, he said, which is a sentence you don't expect to miss until you do, like quiet from a neighbor who fought with the TV every night and suddenly stopped. He pointed upstream where the current looked almost bashful, smoothing its own wake, the way a kid pats the bed to hide crumbs. Diego arrived carrying a small canvas face down, which is how you bring a confession you're not ready to say out loud. He flipped it, a child's hand on a rail, not ghostly, not melodramatic, just present rendered with more kindness than technique, which is the better ratio when the world needs reminding how to be gentle. It's not her, he said before I could speak. It's the act of holding on. You might ask where the law lives in a day like this, and the answer is everywhere and nowhere. On the courthouse calendars, in the practices of a facility that now carries futures like fragile glass, and in the minds of people who keep two truths at once without letting either break the other. Policy does not tuck anyone in at night, but it changes which doors stay closed and which open to rooms we must staff with patience. On the street, it shows up as the space we give each other on the sidewalk, and whether we look up when a kid on a scooter passes. Twice, the recorder stayed silent all morning, which felt like a ceasefire I didn't earn. I took that as permission to chase ordinary leads, building permits, theater memos, notes from a community meeting where neighbors argued without rancor about programming, parking, and grief the new PPG of the post-2015 Tannery. A woman in the back row said, "Spaces can hold pain and joy without mixing them into poison," and the room hummed yes in the way people hum when they're afraid to clap. At lunch, Carina texted me a photo. The hinge-shadow had shifted a thumb's width to the left. No more, no less, like a minute hand testing whether it remembered how to move. I walked over with 2 sandwiches, because witnessing burns calories the way worry burns sleep, and we ate on her steps like middle schoolers, experimenting with adulthood. "If it's counting," she said, "what is it counting to?" And I chewed slowly to buy time for an honest answer I didn't have. That afternoon, the city felt draped, like someone had thrown a sheet over a sofa and called it a renovation. The shapes were familiar, but the edges softened to keep from snagging on memory. I ducked into the theater empty, reverent where stage dust floats like tiny verdicts that refused to land. The room had that pre-show hum again, and the air made the small hairs on my forearms stand like congregants. Ready. I told myself I was there for acoustics, but I was there to ask a room for permission, which is not journalism, and exactly what kept me doing the job past the years when cynicism gets tenure. "We won't invite," I said out loud to an empty house. "We'll witness." And the lights stayed off, but the sound changed. Not a metronome, not a whisper, just the feeling of a hinge that had remembered its duty and decided to be quiet about it. Sometimes healing is mechanical. Sometimes grace is grease. On the way out, I noticed a paper program left under seat E12, a roster of names from a production that had lifted the city on a night it needed lifting. I pocketed it, not as a souvenir, but as ballast. Paper keeps a man from floating off when the air gets thin. Outside, the rain had quit like a smoker who finally means it, and the courtyard smelled scrubbed, not cleansed. There's a difference. Evening returned with its practical chores. Carino watering plants that didn't need it. Mac counting inventory with ritualistic care. Diego cleaning brushes like absolution. I boiled pasta I would overcook, because that's how grief tastes when you don't salt the water. And I texted my ex a photo of broccoli to buy credit for the week. She sent a thumbs up that felt like a medal given at the finish line of a race where finishing means getting up again tomorrow. At 8:13, the recorder clicked on by itself for 4 seconds and caught a noise that is only about as strange as the world always is when you listen closely. A child laughing once, then the soft correction of an adult teaching the difference between inside and outside voices. There was no metronome, no door sound, no river arithmetic, just the precise music of instruction and care. I played it 3 times, then put the recorder in a drawer, because sometimes you honor a moment by not replaying it to death. Tomorrow, I told Carino when I walked her a thermos of tea, we try a thing. We don't wait by the rail. She nodded, relieved. Vigilance is a muscle that tears if you don't alternate with rest. We'll go to the river at dawn, I said, and bring nothing that records but our bodies, which sounded more mystical than intended but landed right anyway. Dawn showed up early, like a friend who doesn't knock, because they live there, and the river met us without preamble. Mac was already on the bench, ledger closed for once, hands on his knees like a man who respects ceremonies he didn't invent. Diego arrived with empty hands and bright eyes, and we stood in a row. Witness, witness, witness. The water moved in long sentences, the way good storytellers talk when the point is not surprise, but recognition. Gulls strode the railing like back row ushers, who could work the front if they had to. And the ocean did what the ocean does best when it's choosing kindness. It pretended to be a lake. We didn't count. We didn't name. We stayed. And when the breeze shifted, it brought a sound I'll fail to describe properly, because success at description often cheapens what deserves reverence. Not a voice, not a metronome, not a door, but the faintest echo of a promise kept. It lasted exactly long enough to be believed, and not a second longer. We exhaled like people who had been holding our breath since a year with a 5 in it. And then the day began like days do, with garbage trucks and joggers and coffee lines, pretending the extraordinary is merely the world being thorough. Back at the tannery, the hinge-shadow had thinned to almost nothing, a pencil line where a thick mark used to be. Carino touched the rail without flinching, and the theater across the way warmed its lobby lights the way a house wakes slowly, considerate of sleepers. The recorder stayed off, and my clock ticked forward in a manner so normal, I wanted to throw it a parade. Don't mistake this for closure. It isn't, and communities that pretend get brittle. But it is a hinge that remembered its job, and a door that for the moment has decided not to argue. There's more to tell about the hearing that followed, about a mural that made strangers touch their own chests without knowing why, about a letter left on my doorstep with no return address except the ocean. But for now, hold this. Sometimes the unexplainable isn't a violation. It's a repair. The letter on my doorstep wore ocean on its breath salt, kelp, and that faint iodine promise of weather moving in from somewhere you can't name until it arrives, and the envelope had no stamp, only a careful fold and a press of thumb I didn't recognize. Inside was a single page torn from a legal pad, the lines pale blue like a river in winter, with 5 words printed in an unshowy hand. Count only what counts, Nate. No signature, only a dot pressed too hard at the end, the way you finish a sentence when you need it to stay done. And beneath that a soft graphite smudge, as if someone changed their mind and let the eraser do mercy's work. I turned the page over like a detective in a TV show and found nothing, which is the most honest companion a man gets in this line of work. And I laughed because the world is generous when it lets you be ridiculous in your own kitchen. I made coffee. It tasted like pen caps and called Mac, who said only, "Bring it to the river," which is a thing fishermen say when the problem is bigger than the dock. We met at his bench where gulls negotiated treaties over crumbs and the sand. Lorenzo rehearsed its good behavior like a kid on probation, eager to show it learned the right words in the right order. He held the note by the corner and squinted as if ink could confess, then handed it back without ceremony, which is how real things often travel hand to hand with no flourish at the handoff. "You think it's from?" He began and didn't finish, because names are heavier than they look when they've lived in. Headlines and verdicts and risk matrices you can recite in your sleep, but still wake up because of. "I think it's from the part of town that still knows how to whisper," I said, and he nodded like a tide chart confirming a hunch. Diego arrived late and unflustered, which is how painters tell time by shadows and tasks instead of clocks, and he brought a canvas he refused to show until he could put it in the right light, which turned out to be the kind that breaks through clouds like a polite guest clearing their throat. He set the painting on the bench and stepped back, and there it was, the hinge-shadow, exactly as it had been the first day we noticed it, except the door it belonged to wasn't a rail anymore. It was a blue-green mouth of water half a street wide. "I didn't invent this," he said softly. I just stopped ignoring it, and even the gulls paused their critiques long enough to let the sentence land. "You ever think solved is a verb and not a state?" I asked, and Max said, "Every morning," which is an answer you only get in towns that have practiced grief without surrender. The theater across the way clicked its lobby lights on, a faint admission of wakefulness, and the courtyard held still as a photograph that refuses to fade because the memory won't let it. For the first time in days, the recorder in my pocket felt like excess. The note had given me different instructions, and I obeyed because disobedience to good advice is one vice I've spent down to the coin. We took the long path along the river, where the railings know the difference between a hand that skims and a hand that holds, and past the spot where Max Ledger once called the sound a metronome, like it wanted to civilize the uncanny into something you could set a tempo to. No sound today beyond the civic choir of morning. Bikes, polite dogs, the hush of people trying not to think about the one thing we all think about when the anniversary comes around the corner, like a bus that might be yours. The air had that cleaned feeling of post-storm edges, like the city had showered and put on its good shirt, even though it didn't plan to leave the house. Karina joined us with a thermos that made the bench smell like cinnamon and decent decisions, and she reported that the hinge-shadow had thinned to a hair, then to the idea of a hair, and then to something you only see if you close one eye against the sun and decide you believe in it anyway. "I kept the chair out," she said, almost apologizing, and we all shook our heads because some chairs stay out in a community like a form of punctuation commas for breath, periods for rest, colons for whatever comes next. "Count only what counts," she read from the note, and we let the instructions settle on our shoulders like a light jacket. Afternoon brought a community meeting in the theater, a familiar civic choreography of nods and hand raises, and the slow progress of people learning how to share a room with their differences without setting the room on fire. The agenda was practical leases, programming, the smell of rain still clinging to the upholstery, but under it ran the old current. Who gets to call this place home? And what do we do when the law answers differently than our hearts? A counselor spoke about how healing takes time measured in seasons and how courts measure in minutes. And the room hummed that complicated. Yes, we had learned together. During public comment, a woman with a voice like sea glass soft edges, tough core said, "We can hold what happened and who we want to be without breaking." And someone behind me whispered amen in a language that probably wasn't church, but knew the shape of the word anyway. I looked at the aisle where I'd stood on nights when the news felt heavier than print could hold, and realized my hands weren't shaking, which is a small mercy, and also a sign the hinge had chosen to work invisibly again. The lights stayed kind, the air stayed cooperative, and for once the sound system did not invent a hum to remind us electronics have egos. After, Diego pulled me aside with the canvas of the blue-green door and said, "I think it moves," which is the kind of sentence you only say out loud when you trust a listener to hold it without squeezing. We set it against the lobby wall, near a window where light arrived with manners, and I watched the paint behave exactly like paint until the shadow in the corner, the one that belonged to neither of us, shifted as the clouds thinned, and the door's edge caught it like a sail catches wind. Maybe it was optics, maybe wish, maybe the ordinary miracle of angles and patience. The result was the same. A line that used to be still inclined itself toward open by a degree no measuring tape has patience for. On the walk back to the courtyard, we passed a girl on a scooter, laughing, hair doing that aerodynamic flag thing childhood accomplishes without a license, and her dad jogged 10 steps behind with a smile that had more caution than speed. They made the shape of relief in motion, the kind you see in a city that is trying very hard to be better at noticing. We stepped aside the way you do for parades and funerals, which is to say, with respect. Evening returned with the soft shores again, and the hinge-shadow on Carina's rail completed its vanishing act, leaving behind a surface so ordinary I had to resist the urge to thank it out loud for learning restraint. The recorder in my drawer stayed put, like a dog who knows when the humans are having a necessary conversation, and my clock behaved like an adult who has learned not to rewind the past to cheat the present. For dinner, I supervised pasta less harshly and let broccoli win, which is not character development so much as truce. At 9:17, the ocean sent its standard memo through my window screen. A little salt, a little cool, a little reminder that it keeps score, but not a threat. And I felt, for the first time in a long run of firsts, tired in the useful way that sleep respects. Before bed, I read the note again and put it inside the theater program from seat E12, which felt like it had been waiting for a roommate. Count only what counts, the page said without saying, and for once I didn't argue with paper. When morning came, the city had its hair combed and its shoes tied, and the river practiced being a river with no metaphors imposed upon it, which is the best any of us can hope for on a weekday. There would be more hearings, more articles, more careful minutes, where strangers would weigh a future that a community would carry together, unevenly and earnestly as always. And I would keep walking the path between the theater and the rail and the river, not to chase a sound, but to learn the quiet that follows when a hinge decides to be generous and the door remembers we are the ones who must pass through each other with care. The week unspooled without spectacle, which is its own courage in a place that learned to brace for sirens the way other towns brace for snow. I wrote small stories permits granted, a park cleanup, a quiet donation to a youth program whose board meets in a room that smells like tempera paint and stubborn hope, and each line felt like a stitch that holds after you tug it twice. The hinge-shadow did not return, but Carina kept the spare chair out, because some rituals keep us, not the other way around. On Tuesday, a clerk at the courthouse slipped me a schedule change 1 of those minor adjustments that changes who can attend, who can breathe, who can plan a workday around waiting rooms and hallway benches with brutal lighting. "It won't make the news," she said, "but it will make lives." And I nodded because the older I get, the more interested I am in the gravity of small adjustments. I put it in my notebook next to the 5-word letter, because both were instructions for counting correctly. Diego, who had been painting doors as if they were verbs, not nouns, called me to the studio with the voice people use when they've succeeded at a thing they weren't sure they had the right to attempt. The new canvas showed the theater lobby with that kind light that has learned discretion, and in the glass of the double doors, a reflection of the river bent into a shape that could be read as a key if you wanted to be generous with your metaphors. "I think it's about stewardship," he said. "Of what?" I asked. "Of permission," he answered, and I wrote it down because language like that does not pass through a town without laying seed. Mac's leisure went quiet, no metronome, no odd bird behavior, just the arithmetic of bait and return and the kind of notes you write when the sea remembers to be a partner. He underlined a sentence from years back: Gauls wouldn't land, and added in fresh ink, landed today with graceless joy, which is as accurate a description of recovery as any clinical manual that will ever earn a grant. We sat on his bench and let the river do the talking, which it did in long vowels. The letter in my pocket warmed the way paper does when it decides to pretend it's human skin, and I read it again as if repetition could wring a different wisdom from the same 5 words. Count only what counts, Nate. At some point, a sentence becomes a lens, and your life adjusts to see through it. The rest blurs not because it's untrue, but because it isn't for you to hold. I walked the path between river and courtyard with that pare down humming in my chest like a reliable appliance. The next hearing drew a quieter crowd, the kind that has learned to pack snacks, and patience and the particular silence that doesn't argue but does not surrender either. In the hallway, a man I recognized from early vigils touched the wall with his palm like he was checking for a pulse in a building, and I understood, because sometimes architecture is all that's left that knows all the versions of a truth. Inside, language tried again risk assessments, therapeutic milestones, the choreography of statutes, and nobody pretended words could make the past obedient. When the session ended, we exited into a day so clear it felt like an apology from weather, and I realized I hadn't listened for the metronome once. That absence struck me harder than any sound could have. It meant the space in my head reserved for that loop-loop release had new tenants' names of neighbors, details about leases, the memory of a child's laugh captured accidentally and then retired with respect. Karina texted a photo of the rail with nothing remarkable about it, which is a remarkable thing to celebrate. That night I dreamed I was in the theater, alone, except I wasn't. Every seat held a version of the city, the river wearing a scarf, the ocean with a ledger, Diego's eyes on canvas, Mac's bell, Karina's porch light, my ex-wife's broccoli thumbs up, a scooter gleaming not as omen but as simple joy. The house lights dimmed and the stage stayed empty, and from the back a soft applause began, the kind people give when the point is not performance but presence. I woke with my hands stinging like they'd earned the burn of praise. In the morning, a new mural had appeared by the river. No signature, just a field of blue with a single hinge painted in such faithful detail you could count the knuckles 3 and the screws 6, 2 missing paint where a careful finger had tested whether it was real. People slowed for it, the way you slow for weddings and bees, a reflexive courtesy for sacred labor, and I watched strangers touch their own chests without knowing why. A kid asked her mom what that was, and the mom said, "That's how doors work, baby," and I put the sentence in my pocket to keep. A letter waited for me at home, same paper, same hand, same ocean breath. This one read, "You stopped counting ghosts. Good." Beneath it, a little drawing of a door half open, the angle just so, the universal symbol for welcome with boundaries. I laughed out loud in my kitchen and scared the kettle into a sympathetic whistle it hadn't planned. The recorder in the drawer, not a villain, not a friend, just a tool stayed where I left it, and I found myself grateful for the simplicity of its obedience. Technology likes to pretend it's prophecy when you're exhausted. Fatigue forks meaning into nonsense with alarming efficiency. Today, nonsense had no purchase. The hinge had taught me to love small mechanics again. In the afternoon, I walked the Tannery path with a neighbor I barely knew before 2015 and knew intimately by 2016, the way crisis compresses acquaintance into a braid you can tow a boat with. We pointed out ordinary things with the reverence of tour guides. A repaired step, a new tree, the way the wind learned the corners of a building and stopped slapping them raw. "It's quieter," she said, and I said, "Or we are," and neither correction mattered. Evening brought the ocean's standard memo salt, cool, the tacit note that it keeps score, and I wrote a line in my notebook. I'd avoided for years. We are a city that survived its own echo. It wasn't triumphal. It didn't try to draft joy into a parade that wouldn't fit in our streets. It was just accurate in the way a high tide mark is accurate. Accuracy in this context felt like tenderness. At 10:04, a small thing happened that would not matter anywhere else and mattered here. The theater lobby lights blinked once in a pattern that looked accidental unless you'd stood in that lobby enough nights to know the building never does anything truly by accident. Blink, pause, blink, blink. If you want to hear SOS, that's your business. I heard an RSVP. Diego texted, "Show tomorrow." Not mine. Ours, and attached a photo of the lobby, the doors reflecting a river that had remembered how to be only water. I put on a shirt with buttons, because some ceremonies deserve collars, and I stood at the window and watched the dark behave, which is rarer than we admit. The note on the table, the one that taught me a lens, sat under a smooth stone from a beach, where the tide keeps its appointments, and I thought of Mac's ledger and Karina's chair and a city that, on good nights, agrees to behave as if kindness were contagious. Sleep arrived like someone who knows the code to your door and uses it with care. Morning would bring the show, and the show would bring something like a benediction if we let it, and the law would continue to do its sober work in rooms where paper holds the line against chaos, and none of that would erase what happened. But it might teach us a new arithmetic. Count only what counts, and let the rest be water under a bridge you maintain together, bolt by bolt, hinge by hinge. That's the story I promised at the start, not of lights flickering or doors flying open, but of a community remembering how to move without scraping the frame. The show wasn't billed as a memorial, or a reopening, or even a program with a thesis. The poster just said doors, with a time and a place and a ticket price that assumed you'd pay more in attention than in cash, which felt like the right economy for a town that had been spending carefully for years. The lobby smelled like rain, deciding to forgive concrete, and the crowd gathered in that reverent hush reserved for courtrooms and matinees where you hope the understudy is secretly perfect, while the theater itself wore its patience like a good suit that had seen some things and still fit. Diego stood by the entrance, with paint still hiding under a thumbnail, not performing calm so much as choosing it, and Mac slipped in late with his ledger left at home, a decision I clocked with a private nod, because even rituals deserve a night off. The lights dimmed, and a single hinge projected large on the screen filled the room with its unapologetic utility, 3 knuckles and 6 screws, exactly as in the riverside mural, no metaphor required, just the anatomy of movement when it behaves. A door frame appeared next, and a wash of blue-green that was not a door and not water, but something between. And the sound design offered no metronome, no loop-loop release, only a breath held, then released in a room that understood the choreography by heart now. People shifted in their seats, the way bodies do when memory reaches under the ribs with gentleness. And somewhere in the back, a peppermint unwrapped with the ceremony of church. A narrator gentle, not grand, told a story about maintenance, about how communities live or die by bolts tightened on time and hinges greased before the squeal demands attention. And it felt like the most radical thing a stage had done here in a decade. Insist on the heroism of upkeep. Images of the river and the courtyard, and the theater cycled without insisting on tears, and the only overt reference to law came as a line that like a blessing. Policy draws the limits. People decide what passes through, delivered with the steadiness of someone who has learned not to rush a truth just because it is true. The crowd hummed that low ascent Santa Cruz has perfected, neither triumph nor defeat, just the decent friction of a community choosing to show up again tomorrow. Halfway through, a child on a scooter part of the piece, brave and ordinary, crossed the stage with the measured confidence of someone who has been told both yes and careful in the same breath. And the theater did not shatter under the weight of that image. It held, which is the point of theaters and cities alike. The sound designer gave us a single laugh, quick and clear, and an adult soft correction that was not a shushing but a shaping, and the room breathed together without instruction. Proof we had practiced this kind of listening to competency. No ghosts, no revelations. Only the generous arithmetic of presence added carefully to presence, until the sum felt like shelter. I had brought the note in my pocket like a talisman and a test, and during a blackout between scenes, I unfolded it with the care reserved for photographs and verdict slips, and those 5 words, "Count only what counts," Nate met the dark like they were made for it. When the lights rose, the hinge on the scrim turned barely so slight that a person could argue optics and win, but the room awarded movement the benefit of the doubt, the way you do for neighbors you plan to keep. Diego squeezed my shoulder once, an economy of comfort learned in meetings and vigils, and lines that form before dawn for the privilege of doing the right thing tired, and I let the gesture stand as punctuation. After, the lobby filled with the softly chaotic sound of people lowering their armor without dropping it, and the theater doors reflected the river outside in a shape that read like a key if you had the appetite for metaphor left, which I did, but not the hunger that makes metaphors do labor better suited to policy and patience. Carina appeared with her thermos, having saved us all from bad coffee on nights like this, and she said only, "We kept our hands to ourselves," which was the promise we made at the rail when a shadow tried being a hinge and briefly succeeded. Mac said nothing, which is how fishermen endorse weather, and for once silence did not ask to be decoded. On the walk out, a small notice on the community board caught my eye. Another hearing date, another chance for a room to fill with the careful weight of strangers, charged with deciding whether a door stays closed or tests a new angle, all of it written in fonts that do not brag. I took a photo out of habit, and then put the phone away out of respect for a sentence that has to live longer than a screen. And I thought about the ledger, the mural, the chair, the note, the stage, each a way of holding without gripping, which is the difference between stewardship and possession. Outside, the air felt like a clean shirt, and the river behaved itself without pretending to be tamed, which is as much as anyone should ask from a river or a memory. Back home, I did the dishes like a man who believes in small chores as theology, and the clock moved forward with adult restraint, and the recorder in the drawer stayed a tool instead of an omen, which is an upgrade you don't list on a resume, but feel in your posture. I wrote the final lines for the piece. I knew I'd publish a story, not of hauntings, but of hinges, not of loops, but of letting, not of doors slamming or flying open, but of a community learning when to witness and when to work the screws in quiet, regular turns. It ended with the sentence I'd been resisting and finally earned. Solved is not an ending. It's a practice, and we keep it together, here, where the ocean keeps score and still leaves room for grace. The last thing before sleep, I placed the note inside the theater program from seat E12 and slid both into the drawer with the recorder, a trinity of paper and plastic, and promise that did not require belief to be useful, only care, which is a more reliable fuel for towns like ours. I turned off the light and listened to the kind sounds a coastal night makes when it has decided to be merciful tires on wet pavement behaving. Distant laughter that belongs to people who have earned it, the ocean filing its reports without fanfare, and none of it asked to be recorded to be real. Morning would come with hearings and headlines and ledger lines, and a gull or 3 arguing the theology of scraps, and we would show up again, hinge by hinge, door by door, counting only what counts.